Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this latest Basis Technologies webinar in our ongoing series of regular webinars about DevOps and test automation for SAP. As you can see on the screen here, the topic of today's webinar is going to be talking about why automation is so crucial as you transition to and adopt S/4HANA and move forward with that as a new platform for your business. A little bit of admin before we start today's webinar. You will notice in the GoToWebinar control panel that you are on mute if you're an attendee today. Everybody's on mute, but if you do have questions, we would encourage you to enter those in the question box in the control panel there. We're going to aim to run for about 45 minutes today, but we'll try and get through as many questions at the end of the session as we can regarding what comes in. We're also recording today's session, as we always do with these webinars. So if you've signed up today, for anyone on the call or registered, we will send a link to a recording of the webinar to you. So if for any reason you don't see that after today's session and you would like to obtain a link to the recording, do please get in touch. You can do that via our website, or there'll be some details at the end of the webinar today. So moving on quickly to today's agenda and what we're going to look at. So once we've done the introductions to today's speakers, we're going to take a little look at just where we stand with S/4HANA today to just frame the conversation and what we're going to be talking about. And then we're really going to focus on the importance of automating management of change as you move to S/4HANA and you start running with S/4HANA. And for the main part of today's presentation, we're going to take a look at a customer case study that is a great example of how change automation has helped them to facilitate what is a very large multi-year S4 transition project. And then once we've done a bit of a wrap up at the end there, as I've mentioned, we will go through the questions that have come in and do a bit of Q&A. So in terms of today's presenters, my name is Peter Yabsley. As you can see on the screen, I'm head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies. I'll be taking you through the first part of today's presentation, and then when we get to the main section, particularly around the case study, I'll be handing over to my colleague David Lees, who is joining me here in the room in Richmond in the UK today. David, welcome.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Basis Technologies. I've been with Basis for just over 1 year now, and I joined Basis after spending about 20 years with Procter & Gamble. Doing a lot of the different roles, but most recently leading their overall global platform architecture and planning and executing part of their S4 transition and transformation.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks very much, David. So without further ado, let's move on to the content in today's webinar. But before we begin, I just want to give a quick introduction to Basis Technologies. I'm sure that many of you who have joined us today are familiar with Basis and what we do, but just for those of you that aren't, a quick introduction to our business and what we do. And fundamentally, what we do is we create automation software that enables our customers to change the way they run SAP, and therefore changes the way in which their SAP systems can respond to the needs of their business. And what we particularly enable organizations to do is to bring modern development approaches like DevOps and continuous delivery into their SAP environments, which historically may have been very disconnected from the ways of working that we see in other IT teams. So our platform is the most complete DevOps and test automation platform that is specifically engineered for SAP. And that's really the important point, is that the automation tools that we've been creating for the past 20 years are specifically and uniquely designed to cope with the architectural requirements and the technical requirements of SAP systems. And that's what enables us to support these different approaches and ways of working in the somewhat special world of SAP. We're very much a global company. We have offices throughout the world. The headquarters is here in London in the UK, where I'm speaking to you from with David today. We've also got an office in Dallas in the US, in Berlin, Germany, and Australia, in Sydney, Australia as well. And you can see some of the kind of organizations we work with on the screen here. Some of the world's biggest users of SAP who really get immense value from automating many different parts of their estate. but also some organizations which, whilst they're very big companies, may have simpler or smaller SAP estates, but still see value from implementing tools that streamline their processes and bring more effectiveness and efficiency in how they can manage their day-to-day work in SAP. So that's a very quick overview of basis technologies. Let's talk about S/4HANA. So the wheels are moving, the bandwagon is rolling, S/4HANA is upon us, but maybe those wheels aren't moving quite as fast as some people had expected. I think we can all agree that's certainly the case, in fact. And there are some surveys, quite recently one from Gartner, for example, that have suggested that only 20% of existing SAP customers have adopted S/4HANA, and even that 20% might be optimistic in terms of when we ask the question around what does adopted mean. So still a huge number of SAP customers which have yet to make that leap, and that's reflected in what has been the big news over the past couple of weeks, which is that extension of the ECC support deadline, potentially all the way out to 2030. I mean, obviously the standard maintenance is going now to 2027 instead of 2025, but for an additional fee that can go all the way out to 2030, and that's obviously really a reflection from SAP that the uptake of S4 hasn't been as quick as they would like, as immediate and obvious for businesses as maybe was expected. But in saying that, momentum is growing, numbers are increasing. Recently, it was reported that there are nearly 14,000 licensed SAP customers. And certainly we are working with a number of organizations who are making the move to S/4HANA or already have, and they're doing that because they believe there's a benefit to their business. Sometimes it's technical, sometimes it's much more business driven, but they're seeing positive outcomes of making that move. So there's definitely some momentum growing. And that again is reflected in numerous commentaries in the market. This was a fairly recent quote from last year, I believe, from Gartner, talking about their expectation about how the flood, the tsunami of S4 adoption is going to hit relatively soon. Now, I think we can probably expect that maybe these dates are a little aggressive in light of those recent announcements that I've just mentioned, but the fact of the matter is there is an expectation that momentum is going to build, critical mass is going to build, and there's going to be a large transition, large body of transitions to S4HANA in the relatively near future. But that in itself, actually, according to some commentators, is going to present a problem. In that, firms that wait too long simply might not be able to make that migration when they want to. They might not really have the choice of exactly the time that they do that, just because there isn't enough expertise to go around to make that happen. There aren't enough bodies in the industry to transition the huge amount of SAP customers with their very large and complex estates sometimes to S/4HANA at the same time. And one recent fairly educated estimate suggested that even if everyone started today at a fairly uniform rate, around 35% of the market could miss out and not be able to transition by the new ECC support deadline, just because there isn't enough resource to make that happen. So aside from the business benefit that some firms have already identified, there is also a consideration of maybe just getting ahead of the game in terms of being able to make this move and get ahead of the competition before the bottleneck arrives. So why hasn't everybody moved? Why haven't people jumped on this bandwagon and started going for it with S4? And I'm sure these points will be familiar to the people on the call and no great surprise. And they're certainly not exclusive in terms of what's holding people back from S/4HANA. But some of the key restrictions and things that are slowing it down are, first of all, simply it's difficult to justify the business case and identify the ROI for some organizations. For some it's obvious, but for many others not so much. And part of that is related to the time it takes to safely migrate and the associated cost of that, and the technical difficulty of that migration, especially in those large complex estates that I've mentioned, because of the business risk that brings with it, even if the upside in terms of the business case looks good. And we combine these factors together, and that is holding many organizations back. but there is something that we can all do, and certainly some of our customers are implementing to alleviate these factors, and that is automate. And software automation can really help address some of those challenges of moving to S/4HANA, and we're particularly going to look at one area of that today. But automation can it help to accelerate the process? It can help to reduce the risk and disruption involved by minimizing the errors, which are often manual in nature. We're certainly going to require fewer resources and fewer people if we automate, and that's also potentially going to help us with that resource bottleneck that I talked about just now. It's going to be cheaper if it's faster with fewer people. That's just a natural consequence, and all of that together is going to help us to reduce the business, to increase the business justification of moving to S4 and put our business case together in terms of ROI, if we can make that move and that transition faster, safer, and more cost effective. But as ever, in pretty much anything we talk about in software, to do this effectively, you're really going to need a number of different automation tools for different purposes, because typically tooling is focused and specialized in particular areas, and there's a few examples on the screen there of where that might apply. And what we're particularly going to look at today is the importance and impact of controlling and governing the development and delivery of change, both during your move to S/4HANA and as you run S/4HANA afterwards. And it can seem like a subject that is a little obvious and maybe somewhat neglected in some of the big picture things, like, for example, data migration. But I think what we're going to take you through today will emphasize just what a big part of the picture this can be and how much it can help you in that journey. So in saying that, I will hand over to David to take us through the central part of today's webinar. David, over to you.
Very good. Thanks, Peter. Okay, so as mentioned, we're going to look at specifically automating the management of change during the move to S4. So the first thing that every customer will need to do for themselves is to understand and select the approach that they will be taking. I like this particular diagram that kind of shows that this isn't a binary choice between brownfield and greenfield. There is a kind of a spectrum of options that include, in the middle, some hybrid choices that can include landscape transformation as well. So you've got the traditional big bang brownfield at one end on the left-hand side. As you move towards the right, shell creation would still largely retain the existing workbench and customizing that you have, but would drop all of the master data and all of the transactional data, allowing you to then selectively migrate or even bring together more than one system in a transformation type scenario. The next one being mix and match is more greenfield in nature, so starting out with a fresh installation, but still bringing across a portion or a subset of your custom solution set that you have today, but again with a data migration of some kind. And the pure greenfield on the right-hand side, which could be based around a new model company, which could be looking to leverage SAP's latest best practices and drive a significant process transformation, would really be a re-implementation, or for a net new customer, implementing SAP for the first time. Now, some of the considerations that may influence which of those options would be right for you are kind of shown here. So if you have an existing industry solution or a business function that precludes you from being able to do a system conversion, that may mean your only option is a greenfield or a mix and match based approach, because technically there's no path for you to take your existing system. If you want to use this as an opportunity to reduce the number of SAP landscapes that you have to drive a consolidation or a simplification of some kind, then you're probably looking more towards the hybrid bluefield scenario in the middle. if you have a very early release, if you're still on 4.6c or one of the earlier enhancement packs of ECC6, you may not want to go through the number of prerequisite steps that would get you to a minimum level in order to enable a technical brownfield conversion. So that may mean you're more interested in the hybrid or the greenfield. The more customization that you have in your existing landscape that is used and that still brings your business value and that you want to retain, I think the more that will push you away from greenfield towards one of the other options. If you want to avoid a big bang, if you don't want to take the risks associated with your entire scope of whatever's running in one of your SAP ECC systems today, if you want to go for a pilot or a phased migration, then obviously that's going to move you away from brownfield. And if you're targeting the cloud edition of S4HANA, then obviously greenfield will be the only option, as you will have to be re-implementing in a new system that you install that is running as more software as a service. So what that kind of leads to is, depending upon the approach that you take, and it may not be one size fits all. So if you have multiple ECC landscapes today, or you target multiple S4 landscapes in the future, it could be that for your finance, you may select a greenfield or a hybrid approach. For some of your other systems, a brownfield could make sense. So it doesn't have to be one choice for your entire estate. But regardless, I think the cutover strategy will either mean that you're doing this in a big bang with high risk, or you're doing this in some type of phased transition, which in turn will likely make the project duration longer. Now, regardless of how you migrate, one of the challenges you would face is for dual maintenance. And let me just kind of walk through what that dual maintenance challenge is for those who are unfamiliar with that term. Let's assume you have a fairly standard, simple ECC landscape today, here represented as one development, one test, and one production system. One of your first steps will be to create the S4 development system. If you're going greenfield, that would be as a fresh installation. If you're doing hybrid, then that would either be a fresh install or it would be a shell copy without any data, probably based on the current ECC production system. And if you're doing brownfield, that would likely be a direct technical conversion of your existing ECC development system. So once that system has been created, you have the work around engineering your solution on S4, including any code remediations, any of the simplification items that are necessary with S4. And then at some point, you will build out a test system to start doing your validation. Again, that could be based on a copy of what you've done so far in the S4 dev system, if you're doing greenfield or hybrid. Conversely, if you're doing brownfield, you would perform another technical system conversion, this time probably based on your ECC production system as a basis. And then after you've successfully tested and signed off, you will have a production cutover of some kind. Again, the system will be created either as a blank system into which you will be migrating a subset of your master data and transactional data, or you will do that during a big bang conversion from your existing ECC production system. Finally, after you've stabilized, you would operate on a going basis in your S4 landscape. Depending upon whether you have multiple waves, this process from phase 1 to phase 5 could take from half a year up to multiple years. And as we look at the case study, we'll see a scenario that was more the multi-year scenario. But that really poses some questions or some challenges during that transition state. And that's to do with making sure that after you've created that development system on the S4 side, that it stays in sync with changes that you're making on the ECC development system, because you're continuing to operate your business, you're continuing to have projects and changes that are going live, and obviously you don't want to be in the situation that when you come to cutover, there is something missing or some inconsistent configuration between your ECC landscape and your S4 one. So during that time, how do you identify the changes that matter? How do you synchronize the application of those changes to production? And in certain cases, how do you ensure that you don't have two separate teams changing configuration, one on the ECC side, one on the S4 side, but going in separate directions that mean you're no longer managing a consistent template or a consistent set of configuration for your business? So let's look at the case study. We're going to be talking about a large global consumer goods company with over $65 billion in sales and close to 100,000 employees worldwide. One of the world's largest SAP estates, and they actually are starting out with quite a complex one-to-many, so one single development system feeding multiple production systems that they are planning a transition to S4, including some level of landscape simplification during that program. Now, some of the key challenges are, because this will be a multi-year journey, they obviously don't want to impose any kind of change freeze. They want to minimize the business disruption during this transformation, that it will be a multi-year activity. They also want to manage their future S4 landscapes more efficiently and in a more modern development and delivery way compared to how they're able to do that on the ECC landscape today. And lastly, they want to avoid kind of previous painful experiences. So during the migration to ECC, if we cast our minds back to the mid 2000s, they had the same complex one-to-many 4.5 landscape at the time, and without sufficiently robust processes around dual maintenance, meant that they had to restart their ECC journey project 3 times in total until they had a process in place that was really fully governing and fully managing the dual maintenance, so that they were in control and would not find that when they migrate to ECC that there were missing changes to programs or missing configuration. So what we'll be kind of talking about today is one of the Basis Technologies solutions called Active Control, which is focused on helping customers manage their change and release automation in a more fast, flexible, and safe way, allowing them to adopt more DevOps practices for on-demand SAP delivery and integration into a wider tool chain that varies from customer to customer, depending upon how they are handling their IT service desk, how they're handling their product backlogs. Now, this third item is obviously where we're going to be spending the most time in this case study, which is looking at support for the transition to S4. And all of this with a very rapid implementation time, obviously leading to therefore a very strong return on investment. So let's kind of take a look at some of the key challenges in addressing dual maintenance with automation. On the left-hand side here, we have a representation of the existing called legacy supply chain and financial ECC landscape. This is the one-to-many landscape that has one development system feeding multiple paths to multiple production systems. And we're looking at the first phase of their S4 transformation, which is to the S4 finance. Obviously, at a later stage, there is then also going to be a transformation for the supply chain scope, but that will really be handled as a separate initiative. So because this ECC landscape represents more than just finance, the first challenge is identifying and understanding which changes on the ECC landscape need to be considered for dual maintenance, because it's not all of those changes, and how can we maintain as many of those as possible in an automated way between the ECC and the S4 development systems. The second thing we'll look at, obviously the move to S4 with a very large custom code footprint can mean there is a significant challenge around the amount of custom code remediation that has to happen. And if that all happens as part of the initial engineering work, there's an ongoing need to consider what changes are happening on the ECC side and how do they best get merged with the changes that have had to happen to make these custom solutions compatible and operate successfully on an S4HANA platform. The third thing we will look at is to do with synchronization of deployment through the landscape, and we'll talk some of the use cases or some of the reasons why that may become relevant or important. The fourth item is looking at the maintaining the template, or in some cases even protecting or locking the template so that changes can only happen, for example, on the ECC system during some portion of the overall transformation. We'll talk a little bit about the S4 upgrade. So obviously SAP has a release cadence annually from 15.11, 16.10, 17.09, 18.09, etc., and would expect that will continue. It's also therefore highly likely that during the move to S4, you may also need to be considering an upgrade, either midway through the transformation or soon after the migration has been completed. And then lastly, how does the tool set help to operate that future S4 landscape in a much more modern way, moving more towards continuous delivery type of practices? So we're going to look at each of those in turn. So let's have a kind of double click at the on the identify and maintain challenge. So the changes that are happening on the ECC system need to be understood, and in this case, a subset of those changes need to be queued up for dual maintenance between ECC and S4. Obviously, our goal is to try and manage as much of that in an automated way as possible, both the capturing and the merge or dual maintenance of those changes between ECC and S4. However, we obviously also need to recognize that S4 comes with a number of changes to how the data model is evolving and how the configuration has to be done. So in a certain subset of cases, it won't be possible to simply import the ECC transport into the S4 development system, and it will need to be reviewed and maintained manually. But obviously, overall, we want to have a very clear picture of what changes are in scope, what changes can be automatically dual maintained, and therefore after review or even via scheduling that they happen automatically, and where do we stand in terms of the manual dual maintenance backlog. We also then want to associate the transports on the S4 side with the corresponding changes and transports on the ECC side, so that we can really make sure that those changes either go all the way through, or if they get aborted or cancelled, that the corresponding change on the S4 side is also cancelled. We do this with things like whitelisting, so we can highlight which objects or which parts of the configuration are in scope for dual maintenance, especially if you're looking to migrate only a subset of the scope, for, in this example, the finance scope. The second step was focused on remediation. In this example, the company was also looking to leverage the services of SmartShift that would perform a mass code remediation associated with the move to S4. But on a going basis, we can also integrate our active control solution with Smart Retrofit from SmartShift that allows for more automation of the code comparison between ECC and the remediated S4 code, that in turn can allow more of that activity to be performed automatically, and to ensure that the changes that are necessary in S4 are not being wiped out by a new version of that object coming across from the ECC system. But again, it's all about visibility, transparency, governance, and confidence that you are in control of the dual maintenance activity. The third step here is around deployment, and it can, in certain situations, and in this case it was necessary, to also look at a synchronization of deployment within the landscape, ensuring that the changes that had been dual maintained were deployed into the respective ECC and production systems at exactly the same point in time. Now, this was important for the S4 finance use case because the client was migrating to central finance. They were deploying an architecture whereby all of the accounting postings were going to then be replicated in real time between the source ECC production system and the target S4 central finance system. Obviously, if there is a missing configuration item, it could lead to these accounting documents failing to post. And in an even extreme case, if there is an inconsistency in the configuration, it could lead to the accounting document successfully posting, but with an inconsistent result compared to how that accounting document posted on the ECC side. So maybe not in all cases, but in some cases, it could be relevant. It could be important to have, again, the confidence that changes will only move through the landscape in a synchronized way. We touched on this a little bit in terms of template protection, but imagine that you have a certain set of configuration, be it legal entity structure, tax codes, currency codes, what have you, that you only want to be mastered out of a single dev system. In this case, for example, the ECC one. The corresponding configuration on the S4 side, you would only want to allow that to be updated via the dual maintenance process, either with automated transports or in some cases, a small team who is allowed to manually dual maintain. And at a certain point in time, you may want to flick the switch and reverse the direction. You may decide that you're now going to manage the majority of your configuration on the S4 side, and the corresponding configuration on ECC for the remaining supply chain scope would have to be mastered, would have to come from the S4 system. And so again, you can selectively determine which portions of your template you would want to control or lock down on either the ECC or the S4 side. And that may evolve as you go through your overall journey and transition to S4. The fifth item we had was in terms of handling an S4 upgrade. So assuming you have your dev, test, prod system in S4 up and running, during an upgrade scenario, you would obviously copy your landscape, have more of an N+1 type of scenario setup with a development system for your business as usual changes and a separate development system for your upgrade. And again, maybe a simplified version of what's happening between ECC and S4, but in this case, between your S4 version 1 and your S4 version 2, there is still a need to understand and manage potential conflicts, to manage the retrofit or merge between the two tracks. And this is, again, kind of bread and butter scenario for something like active control. If you're managing this while dual maintenance is still going on as well, then again, I'm sure you can imagine the level of complexity you start to encounter and why it becomes crucially important to have the right tooling in place to allow you to manage that with minimal risk. So some of the key outcomes for the client involved in this case study were that they were able to continue to operate their full ECC portfolio without having to trigger any kind of moratoria. They're able to manage a full visibility of dual maintenance status, what's in the pipeline, what's made it all the way through to production, what's still coming. To do that with a minimized amount of resources, without having to kind of build their own tools, processes, Excel spreadsheets, what have you, and being able to manage all of the development on the S4 system fully based on new practices and more modern capabilities. A subset of their changes were synchronized from a deployment standpoint, and again, they had the control and the ability to govern and manage that. And they've also been through, I think, already 2, maybe 3 upgrades of their S4 version, being an early adopter that started out with 15.11. They've kept current with the latest releases of SAP during this transformation. As we look to the future, they're obviously looking to continue to leverage this synchronization capability between their target S4 finance and S4 supply chain landscapes, and continuing to move more and more towards an enterprise CI/CD process to deliver innovation across the S4 and the other SAP systems, such as the SAP Cloud Platform. Obviously, the move to S4 can be viewed as a catalyst for change, an opportunity to address technical debt, an opportunity to move towards more modern practices, to reform the way they are working with their application development partners and tool chain, and to integrate more closely with some of the other best of breed solutions out there, be it ServiceNow, Jira, Azure DevOps, GitLab, Jenkins, etc., for orchestration between SAP and non-SAP, really allowing them to move to more consistent adoption of modern development practices, DevOps and CI/CD, in an area not historically known for those types of capabilities. As we look to the second stage of their transformation, when the supply chain landscape is created, for a period of time, they will have an even more complex scenario to manage, with dual maintenance potentially between these 3 sets of landscapes, and in some cases, changes going either one or bidirectionally between these development systems. And again, it was therefore crucial and key for them to be able to manage that with the right tooling, with the right governance and confidence that they were able to stay in control. Worth probably mentioning that we also have customers that are getting value from this in their ECC to S4 migration with more simple landscapes, They have the choice, obviously, to decide at what point within their application development and deployment do they trigger the S4 dual maintenance. Does that happen between the development systems in the CPG case, or could that also happen after having deployed changes successfully to the ECC production system if there is no synchronized deployment requirement? So those were the main things I wanted to cover. I'll pass back over now to Pete for some further information, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Okay, thanks very much, David. A lot of good stuff in there. Covered quite a lot of ground in a bit of detail in that case study, but if you are interested in learning more about our take on this topic at Basis Technologies and how our tools, in particular Active Control, can help with this, there are some plenty more resources on our website. We've got a recently published ebook on this journey to S4HANA, of which this transition we've covered today is a part. We have a couple of other webinars on the topic as well, somewhat more general, some of them than what we've covered today, and plenty of material also on our blog. David's written a series just recently on the topic of the transition to S4 with a couple of other angles than we've looked at in today's webinar. So, do please visit our website, have a look at those to get a bit more information on how automation can help and some of the key things we need to think about as we're making that move. So to summarize what we've been through, we're just about on time, which is always a pleasant experience. We've looked at how the S4 bandwagon is rolling, but it started slowly. But even though that's the case, we're expecting it to accelerate. And when it does, there's an extra challenge that we really need to start thinking about, which is that potentially there simply aren't enough implementation resources to go around. And we've got to start to factor in whether that should be part of our strategy, and whether we need to make an earlier move because of that restriction and limitation in the market. But either way, it is clear that automation can address many of the key challenges around designing, making the move to S4 and then running the systems when you're there, and can certainly help to bolster that S4 business case. And it's really crucial in managing a phased implementation to S4HANA, and we've seen how a major global CPG company is doing that today with Active Control. But I think that point that David made at the end is also very key, is that we've selected a complex example there to really show some of the areas that maybe aren't always considered and the power that automation can bring in helping to give that governance and visibility and speed and safety around that project. But equally, we have a number of customers who are approaching this in a more straightforward manner, a more simple cutover from ECC to S4 and a more straightforward and shorter build process, but they're still seeing value in managing that process with automation and with tooling like Active Control, simply because of, again, of those elements that David's focused on today around speed, reducing risk, governance, visibility, control, and simply making this a more manageable proposition, because it's really a challenge for many of the organizations that are embarking on it. And of course, we want to make it as easy as possible. And what we are often seeing is that project, both in its scale and scope, and the resources involved, can really act as a wider catalyst for change and give people the opportunity to start working in a different way with effectively a clean slate when they move to that new platform. And as part of that, automation can really deliver lasting value beyond the transition, whether that be S4 upgrades or working in a more DevOps and CI/CD approach, or a combination of the two together. So that's the end of today's webinar. As I say, just about on time. We've just got time for a few questions, so we'll take a quick look and see what's come in. But if you would like to learn more about what our tools can do in this area or more generally, do please visit our website there. You can contact us with any questions or request a demo of the product, and you'll see David's email address there on the screen as well if you've got any particular questions about today's content that you'd like to direct his way after the webinar. So let's just take a quick look at some of the questions that have come in, just having a quick look here. So the first one here is your maintenance relevant or applicable for a greenfield migration? I guess if you're going to just build a new system, do we need to worry about this?
Obviously, if you're not coming from an existing system and you're a net new customer, then dual maintenance is not going to be a scenario. But if you're moving from an existing ECC system, it can be applicable. So let me give you a few examples where it might be. First one is if you're bringing some of your custom code across from your existing system that you will continue to change and evolve in some way during your build out of your S4 landscape. If you've got common customizing that you want to keep consistent between your ECC and your S4, it may be a subset of your customizing, but again, that will be an area that you'll want to stay in control of, kind of like aligning your template between multiple development systems. Hopefully that answers.
Okay, yeah, thanks, David. Got another one here. How much of the dual maintenance, how much of that management between ECC and S4 can be handled automatically? I guess in our case by a tool like Active Control, perhaps even in the case of that customer you were talking about.
Okay, yeah, obviously it depends. I think we've seen anything from 50 to 80% of the changes can be automatically dual maintained, but it depends on what the type of change is that's currently being made in your ECC system. Obviously, there's a certain portion that will need to be manually maintained as it relates to some of the simplification items, some of the areas where SAP has made a fundamental change in how the system is configured. But even where those need to be manually done, it's still critical to ensure that everything is being reviewed and actioned, and that you're confident that nothing is slipping through the net.
Just having a quick look here if we have any other questions. We've got a couple.
Yeah.
So just a question here about non-ECC. Obviously, we focus very much on ECC today, and we have a question about whether Active Control can support other components of SAP systems. David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, it's a more generic question around the capabilities of Active Control, but we are able to deploy Active Control to manage the full range of SAP technologies. We have customers running Active Control on PI, on BW, on CRM, on Gateway, et cetera. We're even able to kind of do some orchestration with things like the SAP Cloud Platform, wherever there's a way for us to kind of hook in via things like CCTS. We can create visibility of those changes in Active Control. We can even manage dependencies between changes in front-end and back-end systems and ensure that, for example, a change isn't deployed into BW until the corresponding ECC change is active, or vice versa.
And then what have we got? We've got a couple more here just before we run up to time. What are the I guess what happens if dual maintenance isn't done in this way, isn't managed well? I've paraphrased the question a bit there, but what was the view of the customer we talked about in terms of their business?
I think it's probably all about risk. There's a risk that if you're not managing dual maintenance well, that the systems diverge. Now, why that becomes important is that when you get to cutover, if you're unaware of that divergence, then it could lead to some type of business interruption or business outage. The more they diverge and the more that kind of you lose control, it could lead to the need to restart the project. So it could have a very significant negative effect on the cost or the duration of the transformation.
Okay, great, thanks. So we've just got time for a couple more here. Just reading through the questions. I think
maybe this one.
So the question here again is, do you need to run Active Control in Solman, And what about the test management side of things, and how does that work? So again, quite a broad question, but maybe you can just touch on that for us, David.
So we basically, Active Control typically is deployed in the Solution Manager system, but it can be in any NetWeaver ABAP system. Most of the time, our customers deploy that in Solman. No other solutions are needed to kind of operate that with Active Control. We kind of directly connect into the target systems for managing deployment, for managing object dependencies, object conflicts, all this type of thing. In terms of test management, Active Control is able through integration to kind of hook into and connect into other tools within your tool chain. We also have a complementary product that we haven't really focused on today, which is called Testimony, which is a very different approach to regression test automation. And I'm sure there are other webinars and other material on the website that if people are interested in that, would be another area to explore and to uncover.
Okay, well, thanks very much, David. We had a few extra questions come in there, so we've gone a little bit over time, but we're going to need to wrap it up now. Thank you to everybody who did submit your questions. We will attempt, if there are any that we didn't manage to cover in the webinar, we'll attempt to get back to you offline. As I've said, we will be sending out a recording, a link to a recording of this. So if you don't see that, do please get in touch. And we hope to see you on the next Basis Technologies webinar. So thanks very much for joining us.